Sometime between 65 and 80,000 years ago, the sun was setting over the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the sandy beaches of Sunda, or modern-day Southeast Asia. The waves lapped gently against the shore as a group of people scurried about, setting up their camp for the night. They had spent the day fishing in the nearby waters, and now it was time to cook their catch of fresh fish, dugong, and shellfish. One of the people began building a fire using dry twigs, leaves, and branches collected from the nearby forest. Once it was arranged in a way that would allow the air to flow freely and feed the fire, they pressed a long, thin piece of wood against a thicker, flat piece and began swiftly and expertly spinning it back and forwards between their hands. After just a few short moments, the bottom piece began to smolder, and they turned it over to drop the ember into a shredded piece of coconut tuft. Blowing gently and rhythmically, smoke began to billow out of the dry material before it suddenly burst into flames. The other members of the group began preparing their catch, cleaning and gutting the fish with long obsidian blades, butchering the dugong with hafted axes, and cracking open the shellfish with hammerstones so that the soft meat inside could be easily accessed. Once gutted and cleaned, they placed their bounty over the fire, turning them every so often to ensure they cooked evenly, and as the aroma of the meat filled the air, everyone's mouths began to water. Meanwhile, the children of the group played in the sand, built castles, and chased each other into the waves. But as the aroma made its way down the beach, the children knew it was time. They joined their parents, siblings, uncles and aunts, and grandmothers and grandfathers by the fire and began tearing off chunks of tender flesh with their hands. The night was cool and crisp, about 5 degrees colder than our average modern temperatures, but they sat comfortably around the fire, their faces flickering in the warm glow as they watched the stars come out, shared stories, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. As the children began to drift off, they spoke gradually softer, and the sound of their voices mixed with the sound of the waves to create a peaceful lullaby that spoke to them through the thousands of generations who had done the same before. Only this group was different. They couldn't know it at the time, but they were about to achieve something that no other human had ever done before them. When they had arrived on the beach earlier that day, they had noticed birds flying out east across the ocean. They knew from their past experiences that these kinds of birds were not seabirds, and in fact were not even coastal birds, but these were birds that lived inland among the trees and shrubs that provided them with shelter and nourishment. This could only mean one thing to these people. Somewhere in the distance, there was new land. What they had no way of knowing was that the journey they were about to embark on would be the first time in human history that a new continent would be populated by seafaring people. They had no way of knowing that this new land would be one of the most unique and challenging landscapes on the planet, or that they would become the ancestors to one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. This is the archaeological story of how people came to Australia, what it was like, and how we know when and how it happened. My name is Zane, and this is Unearthing History. Before we begin, I'd like to point out that the introduction is a fictional recount of one possible scenario of how Australia was populated. We don't know for sure, and we probably will never have this level of detail about the ancient past, but I think it's important to understand that the people who made this journey were human, just like us, and I think that this is a great way to establish that connection. I would also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal people from all over the continent have different beliefs and stories of how life began in Australia. The information I'm providing here is just one perspective, it's a scientific perspective, and it's intended to be supplemental to these stories and is in no way supposed to discredit, erode, or disregard the perspectives and beliefs of Aboriginal people. And finally, this is not intended to be a complete history of the archaeology of Australia. Something of that scope would be an enormous undertaking and would take years to put together. People have literally spent years putting it together in books. For example, I could spend hours here solely focused on the climate changes that have occurred over the last 60,000 years that impact people's movements and are related to the archaeology without ever actually getting to the archaeology. Instead, this is presented as an introduction in the hope that it will spark an interest in Australia's ancient and wonderful cultures. In Australia, it is customary to perform an acknowledgement of country whenever somebody gives a speech or gathers for an event, and so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this was recorded, the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects to both them and all Aboriginal people in Australia, elders, past, present, and emerging. Let's begin. When people first came to Australia, it was very different. The Earth was cooler, and because of this, much of the water was locked away in glaciers and ice caps. This meant that the oceans were about 122 meters or 400 feet lower than they are today. This looked different all over the world, but in Australia, where the continental shelf is very shallow, Australia was about 30% larger than it is today. In the northwest of Australia, where there is now ocean separating the Northern Territory and the northern tip of Queensland, there was a lake larger than any other the continent has ever seen. This region was also entirely connected by land to Papua New Guinea and the Torres Strait. In the south, Tasmania was connected to Australia, and in the middle of what is now ocean separating Tasmania from the mainland was another huge lake. Overall, Australia had an additional 7.7 million square kilometers or 4.7 million square miles of additional land, and it looked so different during this time that we give it another name. We call it Sahul. Sahul was a cooler place than it is now, with temperatures averaging around 5 degrees below modern times. And because of this, the continent was wetter and had more forest and grasslands than it does today. The extent of these forests and grasslands fluctuated through time as the polar ice caps got bigger and smaller. As they expanded, Sahul became cooler and drier, causing the grasslands and forests to recede and be replaced with semi-arid plains. As the ice caps shrank, the temperatures became warmer and rainfall increased, causing the grasslands and forests to expand. At this time, Sahul was also home to a variety of animals known as Australian megafauna. These animals varied in size, but as their name suggests, were typically very large and weighed over 100 kilos or 220 pounds. One such example, and a personal favourite of mine, is the Diprotodon. This was the largest marsupial to ever exist at 3 meters or 10 feet long, 2 meters or 7 feet tall, and weighing up to 2,780 kilos or 6,130 pounds. This thing was enormous, and it looked like a rhino-sized wombat. Much less adorable examples include Thylacoleo carnifex, which was the largest carnivorous mammal to have ever lived in Australia and was about the same size as a female lion, and Megalania, which was a giant lizard with a maximum length of 7 meters or 23 feet and weighed up to 1,940 kilos or 4,277 pounds. As a point of reference, the largest living lizard on Earth right now is the Komodo dragon, and these typically weigh around 154 pounds or just 70 kilos. The largest kangaroos ever also existed during this time and stood up to 2 meters or 6 foot 6 tall and weighed up to 240 kilos or 530 pounds. Some of these animals have made it to modern times, for example the red and grey kangaroos, goanna lizards and saltwater crocodiles, but they've typically become much smaller and branched into slightly different species in the process, which is why we consider them megafauna and not just big versions of what we have today. The topic of why megafauna went extinct both here in Australia and the rest of the world is highly contested. It has been argued in Australia that the megafauna went extinct 46,000 years ago, approximately all at the same time, and that the main cause was human hunting. Other researchers have pointed to the fact that 50 of the known 88 megafaunal species in Sahul went extinct before 130,000 years ago, and that there's only firm evidence that 14 of them existed in Sahul when people arrived. Despite historic claims that hunting caused megafaunal extinctions, the first and only direct evidence of hunting was published in 2016. This study cited fragmented shells of an extinct megafaunal bird called Genyornis newtoni, which researchers argued had scorch marks consistent with cooking on them. The latest date we have for the Australian megafauna comes from a Zygomaturus, which is a species of Diprotodon that was recovered from Willandra Lakes in New South Wales and has a date of 33 to 37,000 years ago. This means that at least some of the megafauna survived for up to 30,000 years alongside humans. Okay, I think that's enough about Sahul. The cliff notes are that it was much bigger, relatively cooler, with more grasslands, rainfall and forests than today, and there were a lot of really big animals. Let's take a break and go back to the people on the beaches of Asia for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, Australia looked so different during this time that we refer to it as Sahul. And this is also true for what is modern-day Southeast Asia, which was all largely connected by land, with the exception of some of the Indonesian and Philippines islands. Because of this, we call this region Sunda, and that's where we left off in our story. In order for people to cross from Sunda to Sahul, they had to navigate at least 80 kilometers or 50 miles of open ocean. We know this because separating Sunda and Sahul is the Wallace Trench or the Lombok Strait, which has a minimum depth of 250 meters or 820 feet. Today, the shortest crossing is 20 kilometers or 12.5 miles in the south and 40 kilometers or 25 miles wide in the north. Based on what we know about lower sea levels 65,000 years ago, we know that the Wallace Trench is deep enough that it never connected these two regions by land despite lower sea levels, and that the shortest crossing of open water would have been 80 kilometers or 50 miles when people came to Sahul. Now, this might not sound like a tremendous distance by modern standards, but according to various websites, the average speed of a canoe moving across a flat, windless lake is 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles per hour. If the wind picks up, the speed can be as much as halved, and if the waters are rough, even slower. It's possible that these people used wind-powered crafts, but we just don't have any evidence for it. So, for this thought experiment, let's say that the people travelled in a tandem canoe, which would have allowed one person to take a break while the other continues paddling and vice versa. To allow for changes in wind speed and direction, currents, swell, and physical exhaustion, let's say they paddled at an average of 3 kilometers or 1.5 miles per hour. This would mean that we're looking at a journey of 26 hours and 40 minutes, assuming you know how to navigate a perfect and direct route across the open ocean towards a landmass that you've never even seen before. Now, I don't know if you've paddled in a canoe on the open ocean, but it's extremely physically demanding, and it would be my guess that this probably took far longer. But even still, let's assume 27 hours. 27 hours of non-stop paddling into the open ocean towards an unknown destination is an absolutely terrifying prospect. And yet that's exactly how people made it to Sahul, or some similar version, and we know this because we know what the climate was like at the time, including the sea levels, and we know that they did in fact make it here since, you know, they're here. But how do we know when this happened? Why are we so sure that this happened 65,000 years ago? Well, this is a pretty easy question to answer, but there's one small problem. At the end of the Pleistocene, which is a geological epoch that started 2.5 million years ago and ended 11,700 years ago, the sea level rose about 120 meters. As I mentioned, in Australia, the continental shelf is quite shallow, and this led to the submerging of 30% of the land. What this means for us as archaeologists searching for the oldest sites to figure out when people first got here is that they're now underwater. Deep underwater. Well, kinda. You see, the Timor Sea, which runs across Australia's northwest coast, is on average only 200 metres or 656 feet deep, which is pretty shallow when it comes to the ocean. But these kinds of depths present enormous challenges to archaeology. For context, the deepest a human has ever gone without their equipment was achieved by Herbert Nitsch in 2007, who made it to 253.2 metres or 830 feet. However, he sustained a brain injury on the way back to the surface. The deepest anyone has dived with special equipment was 332 metres or 1,089 feet in 2014 by Ahmed Garba. But these dives were one-off and typically very fast. For example, Ahmed's descent only took 12 minutes and he immediately began to ascend, which took him 15 hours in order to avoid decompression sickness. To do archaeology at a depth of 200 metres or 656 feet, which is what we would require on the coast of Australia, mechanical submersibles would need to be used. The problem is that mechanical submersibles just don't have the capacity to perform the sensitive tasks associated with this type of investigation yet. I know that this is a problem that engineers could solve, but without funding and without a lot of funding, this is still a long way off. Anyway, the point is that any site we find on current land, no matter how close to the coast, is never going to be the oldest because those are underwater. However, the oldest sites on land can tell us about a bare minimum date for the first occupation of Australia. Masjid Bibi is a sandstone rock shelter located in Arnhem Land at the far north tip of the Northern Territory. Arnhem Land is a remote and rugged region with a rich and vibrant indigenous culture. The landscape is dotted with rocky outcroppings, rolling hills, and pristine beaches that extend for miles. This is the home of the Yolngu people. The Yolngu people are made up of 13 different groups, and each of them have a rich oral tradition passed down through generations that tells stories of their creation ancestors and the spirits that inhabit the land. They are skilled hunters, fishers, and artists who have developed a deep understanding of their environment and its resources, and the Yolngu continue to live in this beautiful, rugged, and mysterious land where ancient and modern worlds intersect. It is here that the Mirarr people, one of the groups who make up the Yolngu, first showed archaeologist Johan Kaminga to this ancient rock shelter in 1970. Masjid Bibi Rock Shelter sits in a lush tropical landscape surrounded by dense forests, rolling hills, and sparkling rivers. This area in particular is known for its rugged beauty and diverse wildlife, including exotic birds, marsupials, and reptiles. Masjid Bibi Rock Shelter is nestled into the northwest face of a large sandstone mountain known as Jalwumba and provides a natural refuge from the elements and a vantage point that looks out over the Magilla floodplains. While the entire shelter is approximately 50 metres or 164 feet long, there is only a 5 metre or 16.5 foot area between the back wall and the roof that would be protected from the rain and the sunshine. The walls of the shelter are adorned with ancient rock art depicting the stories and beliefs of the indigenous people who once lived here. Among these images, you'll also find contact art which depicts guns, ships, wagons, and Europeans. The Mirarr people first led archaeologists to Majid Bibi in the early 1970s as part of a survey of alligator rivers. One of the archaeologists working on the project, Johan Kaminga, saw that the rock shelter had a deep deposit and hundreds of rock art panels, which led him to believe that this could be a perfect site to excavate. 3 years later, Kaminga returned to Majid Bibi and conducted a small-scale test pit excavation to a depth of 2.5 meters or 8.2 feet below the surface along the back wall. Kaminga unearthed a shell midden in the top 60 centimeters or 23 inches, which for those unaware is essentially a thick and compact layer of shellfish remains from humans eating the meat inside and discarding the shells. Within the midden, Kaminga found human and faunal remains and numerous stone artifacts including points. The types of animal and shellfish remains found in this layer include marsupial, reptile, bird, crustacean and mollusk. The team has done a lot of testing and experimenting on these artifacts, and they say that there's only a 5% chance that these artifacts have moved downwards. However, there is still a 5% chance, and because of this we can't rule out that this date is incorrect. And so, because of that, 65,000 years ago is the strongest, most provable, and most backed up date we have. It is worth noting, however, that the team really believes that these artifacts have not moved and that they are up to 80,000 years old, so I think I smell another dig coming. Either way, this is an extremely old site and it has a number of consequences. The first is that it validates and adds scientific knowledge to the Mirarr people's cultural knowledge about the length of time that their ancestors have lived in this part of Australia. It also turns two main theories about human movement in the past on its head. The first is the timeline for people leaving Africa. Even though this information was published 8 years ago, if you Google the Out of Africa migration right now, you'll still find maps, articles, and diagrams showing that people arrived in Australia 50,000 or sometimes even 40,000 years ago. With the firm date of occupation in Australia being established at 65,000 years ago, this means that people have to have left Africa much earlier than we thought in order to have made the journey through Asia and Southeast Asia to get to Australia. So this pushes back the timeline of when humans first left Africa, or it means that we expanded a lot faster than previously thought possible, but the latter isn't supported by the evidence. The types of designs present at Majid Bibi are also varied and include human-like figures, geometric designs, hand stencils, a variety of identifiable fish species including catfish, barramundi, long tom, mullet and sardigo, objects made from plant fibres, and even paintings from the time of European contact including firearms, pipes, knives, ships, and European people wearing the typical clothing for the time and standing with their hands on their hips. Unfortunately, at the time of making this video, there is no absolute way to date rock art. Instead, estimates for the age of the visible art suggest they were created in the last 1,500 years. However, you might recall that the team recovered ochre crayons and paint from their excavation in a layer dating to 65,000 years ago. Despite our current inability to directly date rock art, this shows that Aboriginal people have been painting this rock shelter for somewhere in the range of 2,500 generations. This sort of timescale is really difficult to wrap our minds around, but let me provide some context. The oldest evidence of farming is 400 generations old. The first cities in Mesopotamia were constructed 260 generations ago. The Declaration of Independence and the colonization of Australia by Europeans occurred just 9.5 generations ago. What this evidence shows is that for 2,500 generations, or more than 65,000 years, the first Australians have been coming to Majid Bibi to hunt and to gather, to cook their bounties and for shelter from the elements. While they were here, they painted the walls using the earthy colours of ochre in order to express themselves and pass on the traditions and histories of their people so that their culture would live on through time. Those people are still there, still practicing their culture and traditions. In this region of Australia, they are known as the Mirarr people, but across the entire continent you will find similar stories about the people who first came to this rugged and beautiful land, who became the first Australians. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Unearthing History.